Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when something goes terribly wrong in a place that was supposed to be joyful. A gathering filled with food, laughter, and smiling faces, all crammed together under the delusion that family means love. Ours was a typical summer reunion. Folding chairs lined the backyard, paper plates sagged under heaps of potato salad and ribs, and a dozen or so familiar faces made the rounds with lazy, beer-soaked grins. The kids ran half-dressed through sprinklers, while the older crowd passed around memories like old photographs, stories everyone had heard 100 times but kept pretending were fresh. I knew what was coming the moment I saw my mother walk out from the house with that polished smile on her face and a gift box in her hands, the kind wrapped with more tape than actual paper, as if she were trying to keep the truth from escaping. She stood in the center of the yard, bivouacked with my dad just behind her, both of them brimming with anticipation like kids about to open their own birthday presents. My sister Jessica didn't even pretend to act surprised. She played her part well, tilted her head, widened her eyes a little, and said, "What's this?" with that practiced lilt that always got her what she wanted. Everyone leaned in, phones out, like we were witnessing the climax of some feel-good Hallmark movie. Jessica peeled the paper back slowly, always aware of the spotlight, and opened the lid to reveal a set of first-class tickets to Italy, Venice to be exact. 2 weeks, 5-star accommodations, spa packages, gondola rides, the works. People clapped. Aunt Carol dabbed her eye like she'd just watched a wedding proposal. My cousin raised his beer and shouted, "Damn, y'all went all out." And somewhere in the background, my father laughed one of those deep, satisfied laughs that I had never once heard directed at me. I smiled, not because I was happy for Jessica, but because I had been waiting for this exact moment for months. Then, right on cue, my mother turned to me, eyes still shining, and said the words she had rehearsed at least a dozen times. "Don't worry, Rachel, your time will come." Her tone was sweet, condescending, the verbal equivalent of patting me on the head, like I was a damn toddler who couldn't grasp delayed gratification. I didn't blink, didn't bite. Instead, I reached into my purse and pulled out a plain white envelope, the kind you'd use for bills or grocery lists, and handed it to her. "This is for you," I said, loud enough for nearby relatives to pause mid-bite. She looked confused for a second, then amused, like she expected it to be a thank you card, or maybe a handmade coupon for one hug redeemable anytime. But the moment she slid that paper out, her smile dropped so fast it was like a stage curtain falling after a tragic play. My father leaned in, peered over her shoulder, and his jaw locked so tight I thought I heard his molars grind. My sister stopped mid-laugh. Uncle Mike, standing near the grill, turned and just stared. The laughter died, replaced by a strange, suffocating quiet, like everyone was holding their breath, unsure if this was part of the script or a sudden, violent detour. My mother's hands shook, just a little, not enough for most people to notice, but I saw it. The tiny tremble that betrays someone who knows exactly what they're looking at and wishes more than anything they weren't. For years, I played along. I played the good daughter who nodded and accepted the crumbs while Jessica got the cake. I let them have their golden child and their illusion of fairness, their Sunday dinners where they talked about her children like they were royalty and mentioned me only as an afterthought. But there's only so long a person can collect small injustices before the weight of them becomes something solid, something heavy enough to throw. That envelope wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a grenade, and I had pulled the pin right there in their well-manicured backyard. I didn't say a word, didn't need to. The paper spoke for itself, and whatever was written on it had cut through decades of pretense like a hot knife through butter. My mother opened her mouth like she wanted to speak, but nothing came out. Her lips moved, but her voice stayed trapped somewhere between shock and guilt. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever found yourself in a room full of people you've known your whole life? People who think they know who you are, only to realize that for the first time ever, you're the one in control? Because in that moment, standing under the same string lights they'd hung for Jessica's engagement party 6 years ago, the one I wasn't even invited to. I felt it. Not happiness, not pride, but power. Cold, quiet power. And I wasn't about to give it back. I didn't stick around to explain. I left the envelope in her hands, turned without a word, and walked into the house. Behind me, I could hear whispers rising like steam, panicked, low, urgent. Someone asked if I was okay. Someone else said, "What was in that thing?" And somewhere my father muttered, "We should have handled this years ago." But they didn't. And now they were going to see exactly what happened when someone spends their whole life being told to wait their turn and finally decides it's time. There's a unique kind of pain that settles into your bones when you spend years convincing yourself that maybe, just maybe, you're imagining the imbalance, that the favoritism is all in your head, that if you just work harder, stay quieter, be more agreeable, they'll eventually see you, not as the backup, the understudy, the consolation prize, but as someone worthy of standing in the same light they pour so freely over your sibling. For the longest time, I gave them that benefit of the doubt, like some fool chasing crumbs from a table I helped build, but was never allowed to sit at, telling myself that love must come in different shapes and sizes, even if mine looked a hell of a lot like being forgotten. But eventually, the excuses start to crack, and once you let yourself look at the truth without trying to soften it, without the emotional bubble wrap of "they did their best" or "parents aren't perfect," you realize some things weren't just unfortunate, they were intentional. Growing up, Jessica was the sun, and I was a cloud passing in front of it. She was the kind of child who could do no wrong, even when she did. She wrecked Dad's car at 17. No insurance, no license on her yet. And instead of being grounded or even lectured, she got a replacement vehicle within 2 weeks. A shiny little convertible because she needed something safer. I brought home straight A's for 3 years and got a nod and a good job, while Mom didn't even look up from folding laundry. Jessica dropped out of college her sophomore year, and my parents turned that into a virtue somehow. She knew it wasn't the right path for her, they said, like self-awareness was suddenly the same thing as commitment. I, on the other hand, finished with a degree in education, paid for every damn credit myself, and took night shifts at a diner to make ends meet while they spent weekends visiting Jessica and babysitting her kids, delivering casseroles like she was royalty in exile and needed their protection from the burden of her own choices. After a while, it stops being an unspoken dynamic and becomes a known fact. I remember one Thanksgiving, a few years back, when Jessica showed up 2 hours late and everyone just adjusted the schedule around her like the whole damn world needed to shift to fit her whims. Meanwhile, I brought homemade pies and a bottle of wine and got asked, by my own mother, if I was still single in front of the entire family, like my life was just a waiting room until someone finally claimed me. That night, I sat in my car after dinner, crying into my steering wheel, not because I was lonely or sad, but because I knew I could drop off the face of the earth and it wouldn't register as more than a mild inconvenience for them. But the thing that really snapped the last frayed thread of my patience came quietly, not in a dramatic confrontation or a screaming match, but over a burger at a family barbecue, where Uncle Mike leaned over, more than a few beers in, and said, "You know, your grandmother always wanted you and Jess to share that land upstate. That little place in Greene County. That was supposed to be for both of you girls." I laughed at first, thought he was misremembering or just talking nonsense, but something about the way he said it stuck in my ribs like a shard of glass. Later that night, I called him sober, curious, and maybe a little desperate, and he doubled down. Yeah, Linda and Rick said it was too complicated to split it, so they just put it under Jessica's name, said you'd be fine without it. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I started pulling threads, quietly, methodically. I called the county records office. I requested a copy of the deed transfer. I asked a lawyer friend, Melissa from college, to take a quick look at the documents. It didn't take long. The land had indeed been deeded to Jessica outright, with my name conspicuously absent, despite the original will leaving it to both granddaughters equally. The signature on the notarization was dated 3 weeks after Grandma was already in hospice, barely speaking, barely writing, and sure as hell not well enough to sign legal paperwork. Melissa, ever the straight shooter, said, "This is shady as hell, Rach. If you wanted to push, you could." I didn't push, yet. Instead, I started building a case, not for court, but for clarity, for dignity, for the day they'd look me in the eye and realize I wasn't their pet project, their resilient one, their independent daughter who didn't need much. I was just the daughter they decided not to invest in. They always said Jessica needed more help because she had more responsibilities, as if raising kids somehow made her more deserving of support, more entitled to real estate, handouts, backup plans. They called me strong, like that was a compliment, like it wasn't just code for "you're not our priority." But strength isn't the absence of need. It's just the muscle you build when nobody shows up. I stopped telling myself I was imagining things. I stopped defending them to myself. I started collecting copies, conversations, screenshots, emails. I took screenshots of a message from my mother that said, "We just thought it made sense for Jess to have the land. She's the one building a family." I saved the voicemail from Dad telling me, "Let it go, Rachel. It's not worth creating tension over." They never imagined I'd come for the truth. They certainly never imagined I'd do it on the one day they'd be surrounded by relatives, witnesses, people who had bought into the story of our perfect family. That envelope I handed to my mother, it wasn't just proof. It was the last nail in the coffin of the version of events they'd been selling for decades. They thought they'd buried the past deep enough it wouldn't resurface. But I learned a long time ago that buried things don't stay down forever. Not when someone's willing to dig. And I didn't just bring a shovel, I brought a spotlight. There's a cruel kind of irony in how the people who raise you, who clothe you, feed you, wipe your tears, and tell you bedtime stories, can also be the very ones who slice you the deepest, not with blades or fists, but with silence, deception, and a quiet reshaping of what should have been yours by right. I had always sensed that my parents viewed Jessica and me through two entirely different lenses, but I spent most of my life trying to clean the glass from my side, thinking if I just became a little more successful, a little more polite, a little more selfless, they might finally see me as their equal. I carried that hope around like a chipped coffee mug, worn but still functional, comforting even when it hurt my hands. But there comes a moment when hope curdles into awareness, and for me, that moment arrived not with shouting or confrontation, but with the sterile certainty of notarized ink and legal signatures that told a story no bedtime tale ever warned me about. When I first saw the deed, the actual scanned copy Melissa emailed me, stamped and filed with the county, I stared at it for over an hour, not because I didn't believe it, but because a part of me still wanted to believe I had misread it, that maybe there was another page, another document, some missing addendum that would prove this wasn't what it looked like. But there wasn't. It was all there, in plain text, in black and white. The land that our grandmother had wanted to pass down equally to her girls had been signed over to Jessica and Jessica alone, with my name conveniently and permanently erased from the narrative. The date on the notary line stopped me cold. It was dated 3 weeks after Grandma had slipped into full-time hospice care, barely eating, barely conscious, a woman who couldn't lift a fork, much less a pen. Melissa didn't need to say the word forgery. It hung there between her carefully professional observations, like a neon sign no one wanted to admit was glowing. She told me gently that this kind of thing happened more often than people think, especially when aging relatives have valuable property and one child is more involved in day-to-day care, or simply more manipulative. But that wasn't what happened here. Jessica hadn't been the caregiver. She barely visited our grandmother in those last months. It was my mother who handled everything, from appointments to finances, and it was my Fenrirad who drove the paperwork to and from the lawyer's office, smiling all the while, saying it was ooh, just to get things in order. I thought about every moment I'd visited that house in Greene County, every summer week I'd spent running barefoot through the fields, catching fireflies, and listening to Grandma's slow, deliberate voice tell me that, this place is your legacy, Rachel. This land is part of who you are. I remembered the way she'd touch my cheek and say, "Don't ever let anyone tell you you're less than what you are." I used to think she was being poetic. Turns out she was trying to warn me. And the worst part wasn't even the theft itself. It was the calculated confidence with which they assumed I would never find out. The sheer audacity of it. They knew I didn't have the time or money to investigate. They assumed, like always, that I'd stay quiet, play nice, be grateful for whatever scraps I got. But what they didn't understand was that I had spent years collecting those scraps. Memories, observations, snide comments, dismissive glances. And those things don't just disappear, they calcify, they form edges. So I kept digging. I started pulling phone records, looking into who had notarized the document. Melissa traced the notary to a small-town bank clerk, who had notarized the papers without the signer physically present, a practice that, while technically illegal, was common practice in that part of the state. And I found emails my mother had forwarded to Jessica, referring to the land as a gift to your future, since Rachel's never shown interest in settling down. She didn't just take it, she justified it. She rewrote the story. She turned me into the undeserving one, the outsider in my own bloodline, the girl who never needed much. I printed out every piece of it, put it all into that envelope, and sealed it shut. Not because I wanted to expose them in some theatrical explosion, but because I needed them to look at it. I needed them to hold the truth in their hands and realize they were the ones who'd lit the match. And I was just giving them the mirror. I think what broke me the most was the realization that they hadn't done it out of desperation or even malice, but out of something far colder, calculation. They had weighed their options, measured their daughters against each other like assets, and made the decision that Jessica was the better investment. Maybe because she had kids and a husband, maybe because she fit their idea of a life worth supporting, or maybe just because she was easier to control. Either way, they chose her. They chose her knowing it would cost me, knowing it would bury something that could never be fully dug up again. And they did it without blinking. By the time I closed that email thread and printed the last document, I felt something shift in me. Not rage, not even sadness, but clarity. It was like watching a photograph develop in a dark room, slowly revealing the contours of a truth I'd always suspected but never fully seen. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't being dramatic. I wasn't overreacting. They had rewritten my inheritance, my history, my value, and done it with the kind of quiet efficiency that only comes from years of practice. So I waited. I waited for the perfect day, the perfect setting, the perfect lie to be interrupted. I chose the family reunion because it wasn't just about revenge. It was about unmasking. It was about peeling back the illusion they had so carefully curated for everyone else. The illusion of fairness, of equal love, of unity. I didn't need anyone to take my side. I didn't need applause. I just needed them to see what I saw. And more than that, I needed them to know that I wasn't going to carry their secret anymore. If they wanted a performance, I was ready to give them the final act. And it started with a small envelope, a backyard full of witnesses, and the truth they thought would stay buried forever. There is something uniquely satisfying and equally terrifying about watching a lie unravel in real time, especially when that lie has been layered so carefully over the years, wrapped in politeness, cemented with Sunday brunches, and presented to the world in the form of a picture-perfect family portrait. That day in the backyard, when the envelope left my hand and the truth entered theirs, it didn't just detonate the illusion. It set off a chain reaction so immediate and so jarring that even I, who had prepared for this moment with the precision of someone planning a heist, felt the tremors in my chest long before they hit the ground beneath us. The silence that followed wasn't simply awkward. It was loaded, like the hush before a gunshot or the stillness that comes before a hurricane makes landfall. I didn't see what happened immediately after I left the yard. I'd already slipped through the kitchen, past the half-empty casserole dishes and wine-streaked plastic cups, into the guest room to breathe. But from the way the noise outside morphed from cheerful chaos into fractured murmurs, I knew my mother hadn't just closed the envelope and tucked it discreetly into her purse. She must have shown it to my father, or perhaps he snatched it from her hands in a panic, his face contorting into that same familiar grimace he always wore when he was caught off guard. when control began slipping from his grip. I imagined Jessica standing there frozen, her mouth still open in a half-finished thank you, not understanding why everyone had stopped clapping, why her moment had been hijacked by something so unexpected, so personal, so permanent. 10 minutes later, I heard footsteps on the hardwood, quick, anxious, and then a soft knock on the guest room door. It was my cousin Dana, always the neutral party, the peacemaker, the one who floated between family factions without ever taking a side. She pushed the door open, her face already twisted in that blend of curiosity and caution, the look people wear when they think they're about to witness a car crash, but can't bring themselves to look away. "What the hell just happened?" she asked. Not accusing, not even shocked, just quietly unsettled. I didn't answer right away. I handed her a copy of the printout, not the originals, but enough for her to read the outline of betrayal. She sat on the edge of the bed and read in silence, her eyes moving slowly, deliberately, her fingers tightening around the paper as she reached the second page. When she finally looked up, her voice was quiet but sharp. "They really did this, and just expected you not to notice?" That's when I realized how deep the performance had gone, how completely they had convinced not only themselves, but everyone around them, that I was just fine, that I was content with less, that my silence was agreement rather than exhaustion. Outside, the voices grew louder, my father's voice, strained and angry, then my mother's, panicked and shrill. Dana squeezed my arm and left the room without saying another word. I stayed where I was, letting the sound of unraveling wash over me like background noise, like waves hitting a shore that had been eroding for years. I didn't go back out until much later, when most of the crowd had thinned out, when the grill was cold and the plates were mostly cleared and the atmosphere had settled into that weird, post-conflict quiet where everyone pretends nothing happened, but their eyes tell a different story. Jessica was still there, standing on the patio with a half-empty glass of wine, and a look on her face I hadn't seen in years. Confusion mixed with something close to fear. When she saw me, she didn't speak right away. She just stared, like she was trying to figure out who I was, like I had shape-shifted into someone unfamiliar. "Why would you do this today?" she finally asked, her voice tight, trembling with the kind of indignation that only people who've never been held accountable can summon. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even look at her directly. I just said, "Because you've lived your whole life on center stage, and I wanted you to see what it feels like when the lights go out." She flinched, like the words had hit something tender, and for a brief second, I saw a crack in her composure. Not guilt, not empathy, but something far more interesting: doubt. She had always assumed that the things given to her were hers by right, not by manipulation, not by deception, and certainly not at my expense. But now, confronted with evidence she couldn't refute and a sister who no longer played by the rules, she looked like someone realizing the applause had stopped and no one was rushing to cue the next act. That night, my mother called me from a blocked number. I let it go to voicemail the first time, the second, the third. On the fourth try, I picked up, mostly out of morbid curiosity. Her voice was shaking, not from anger, but from the sudden collapse of the story she had spent decades building. "Rachel," she said, "we can talk about this. We didn't mean to hurt you. We thought it was best." That phrase, "we thought it was best," was like nails on a chalkboard. Best for whom? For Jessica? For their pride? For the narrative they wanted to protect? More than they wanted to protect me? "I'm not interested in money," I told her, cutting through the excuses she hadn't even started yet. "I'm not interested in apologies you don't mean. I just wanted the truth out in the open. You don't get to bury it anymore." She tried to plead, offered some vague form of compensation, as if cash could rewrite a childhood of being second. I ended the call without another word and blocked the number. The next morning, Jessica texted me. Not a question, not a conversation, just a blunt accusation. "You ruined everything. I hope it was worth it." I stared at the screen for a long time, wondering how someone could still see themselves as the victim after everything, wondering how deep that entitlement must go. to think that truth is somehow more offensive than theft. I didn't respond. What was there to say? The facts spoke for themselves, and the silence between us would speak even louder. But the story wasn't over yet. Because just when I thought the consequences had settled, just when I thought I had drawn the line and walked away with some version of closure, the past reached out again in a voice I never expected to hear. Not from Jessica, not from my parents, but from the last place I thought any secret could still be hiding. And what came next would prove that even when the truth comes to light, the shadows it casts are far darker than we're ever prepared for. It's a strange, disorienting experience to walk away from a moment you've been building toward for years. The confrontation, the exposure, the final blow that flips the balance of power. And to find that, once it's done, the silence that follows is not triumphant, not vindicating in the way you'd imagined, but eerily hollow, like stepping into a room that used to be full and finding it stripped of everything but the echo of your own breathing. I had spent so long preparing for that moment in the backyard, measured every word, rehearsed every scenario, anticipated the fallout, that once the dust settled and the adrenaline wore off, I found myself sitting alone at my kitchen table days later, staring into a cup of coffee gone cold, wondering if this quiet was peace or simply the aftershock of an emotional earthquake I hadn't fully understood until I'd set it in motion. The days that followed the reunion unfolded in a sort of surreal blur. Some relatives reached out with carefully worded messages, full of concern, masked as curiosity, asking how I was holding up, offering vague, non-committal phrases like, "I had no idea," or "I hope everyone can move past this," while others remained conspicuously silent, choosing neutrality as their shield, as if being polite was more honorable than being honest. A few bold ones, cousins mostly, expressed something close to admiration, telling me in hushed tones that they had always sensed something wasn't quite right, that the favoritism toward Jessica had been so glaring they felt embarrassed on my behalf, but never wanted to stir the waters. I didn't resent them, not really. Most people would rather sip wine and pretend everything is fine than wade into family politics thick with entitlement and betrayal. It was easier to watch the performance than to ask who was writing the script. Uncle Mike called me 2 days after the reunion, his voice heavy with something that resembled guilt, but sat somewhere closer to regret. He didn't apologize directly, he wasn't the type, but he invited me to coffee and said, "You were right to do what you did. You just told the truth. It's the rest of them who can't handle it." We met at a small diner off Route 20, the kind with cracked leather booths and coffee that tasted like burnt earth. He told me stories I'd never heard before, stories about my parents' decisions in the years after Jessica and I left home, about how they spoke of me as if I were an adult before I was even out of high school, how they would praise Jessica for every tiny milestone while treating my accomplishments as expected, barely worth mentioning. He said he always admired how I handled it, but that admiration came with a bitter aftertaste. It meant he'd seen what was happening and had chosen, like so many others, to stay quiet. Then came the letter. It arrived in the mail 1 week after the reunion, plain envelope, no return address, just my name in shaky cursive. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was my father's, a style forged in blue-collar discipline and decades of signing paychecks and school forms. Inside, there wasn't a long apology, no sweeping confessions or attempts at explanation. Just a folded sheet of lined paper with a few uneven lines, ending with 6 words that struck deeper than I expected. "You were right, I was weak." That was it. No salutation, no signature, just that bare acknowledgement, fragile and unadorned, like the man who wrote it had nothing left to hide behind. I held that letter in my hands for hours, rereading it until the words stopped registering and the paper became damp from the sweat in my palms. I didn't cry. I didn't feel angry or vindicated. I just felt tired. Tired in a way that seeps into your bones and reminds you that even the most satisfying justice carries weight. Because there is no undoing the years I spent doubting my own worth, No refund for the milestones I celebrated alone while Jessica basked in applause. No way to rewind to the countless dinners and birthdays where my contributions were footnotes while hers were headlines. The truth might be out now, but its arrival didn't cleanse the past. It merely marked the end of denial. And yet, despite all that, there was something liberating in knowing that the game was over. I no longer had to pretend and I didn't notice the difference in treatment. I no longer had to feign gratitude for crumbs handed to me like gifts. I no longer had to smile through the bitterness that curdled at every family gathering. I had spoken my truth, exposed the injustice, and forced the people who built their comfort on my silence to finally squirm under the weight of reality. It wasn't revenge, not in the way movies portray it, not with dramatic music and slow-motion exits. It was quieter, colder, more permanent. It was reclaiming a version of myself that had been buried under years of manipulation and pretense. And then, just when I thought I had stepped away from the chaos, just when I believed the final chapter had been written, the phone rang again. This time, not from a blocked number, not from my parents, but from Jessica. I stared at her name on the screen, heart thudding with a mixture of dread and curiosity, unsure whether to let it go to voicemail or brace myself for another confrontation. I answered. Her voice was hoarse, brittle in a way I hadn't heard before, like something had cracked beneath her polished surface. She didn't yell, she didn't accuse. She simply said, "I need to talk to you. It's not about the land. It's about Mom. There's something you don't know." Then she paused, something she never told either of us. The line went dead before I could respond, and I sat there, phone still pressed to my ear, trying to make sense of the sudden chill crawling up my spine. For the first time since I'd set this whole thing in motion, I felt uncertain, not guilty, not remorseful, but uncertain, like a door I thought I had closed, was slowly creaking open behind me, revealing something darker, deeper, and far more complicated than even I had dared to imagine. Maybe I had thought exposing the lie would be the end, but maybe it was only the beginning of something else. Something that wasn't just about betrayal, but about the history that shaped all of us. About the secrets woven into our family like threads in a tapestry no one had ever truly examined. Because sometimes the truth doesn't free you. Sometimes it leads you straight into another storm. And I had the uneasy feeling that what Jessica was about to say would change everything all over again.